In this video I'll be explaining animation basics within the program 3ds Max. So animation in Max is similar to other digital formats to where we only have to create the major keyframes within our animation, and the actual program creates the in-between frames, the blending frames in between, so we don't have to create a keyframe for every frame like we would if we were drawing out an animation for a cartoon. So in digital format we only have to set the extremes of our animation, the keyframes are our extremes, and the program actually does the rest for us. So we just have to make sure that we go back and the animation does look how we want to, and if need be we create more keyframes. So at the basics for it, we want to create as little keyframes as possible to create the animation that is needed. So we can always start lower, and it's easier to add more later than to have to go back and delete all these other keyframes that we don't need. So in 3ds Max, there's many different ways to access some animation tools. The very top one is the animation menu up at the top of the menu, or top of 3ds Max, to where there's a lot of more intermediate and professional tools. After you start learning the basics, then we'll get into more of some of these other tools. Then also under the command panel, it is the fourth from the left tool. It says motion. It's some of the basic tools for animation, some of the options as we start pulling up more tools. So if you move over to the one that says display, and then also utilities, we'll be using some of these. But then also there's some creation tools for animation as well, with systems and helpers. Systems is the bones or the biped skeletal structures. Helpers, we can have dummy controls or other points that we can animate later. So that's some basic objects in a scene here, and we're just going to create basic object animation to start off with, so you can get a good understanding of animation before you move to more intermediate skills. So in 3ds Max, there's also at the bottom of the screen a timeline, just as if there was a video editing program. Another animation program like Flash would have a timeline as well. So we have a major timeline. We can change the values of the timeline so it's longer or shorter, positive values or even negative values. It doesn't have to be just positive values. 3ds Max will still render out negative values the same way. It's just on the opposite end in case you want to add animation before what you started on frame 0 or 1. Above the timeline is the scroll bar, so we can simply scroll or scrub back and forth in our timeline, or we could use the arrows on the left and right of the scroll bar to move it one frame at a time. Move over to the right, there is playback option just like there would be in any video editing program or animation program. There's play, backwards, forwards, and move back and forth once a frame as well. What's also nice is in Max we have another option for the play, which is the play selected object. So we can only it'll only play back what is animated when you have that selected. So if you have multiple objects created that have animation on them, it only play back one object that you have selected. So that's the play selection. So also right underneath the playback tools is the actual frame you're on. If you move the timeline around, you'll see that it's a different frame. Also time configuration button, you can't see it right now, but or the actual name of it, but the button to the right of that is a time configuration where we can change the frame rate from 30 frames to any other one. Some major different options: NTSC, PAL. We can choose the time display, which will change the actual display of the scroll bar. If you look down there, it'll change the display there. You can choose playback options here, real time, active, loop, speed as well if I want to go slower or faster, and also the animation start and stop. So right now I'm going to go ahead and change this down to a lower frame. So the end time's 0, the start time's, or end time's 24, start time's 0. So the timeline changed from 0 to 24. A little bit easier to see, so you can scale it in and out. It doesn't delete any animation after or before that. It just zeroes in on slower or a smaller section of it. So animation is very simple. You create your objects and then you use the key options down here in the timeline. So there's three major key options here. There's the auto key button, which really I wouldn't suggest for beginners, but it allows you to create a first keyframe. After you create the first keyframe and you're moving around creating keyframes later, it automatically saves the information to where you wouldn't have to click on this key button later on. But for beginners, I would suggest using the set key button to begin with. If you click on either one of them, it'll create a red border around the viewport to let you know that the set key or auto key button is on. So what you have to do is simply click the set key button, and then each time you want to create a keyframe, you click on the actual set key, looks like a key button. So first off, you want to move to the frame you want to start your animation on, and this time it'll be frame 0. And every time, if you have the set key button, you want to go ahead and click the set key, actual key button, and it'll create a colored bar, a little symbol on that frame to let you know there's a keyframe for this object on that frame. So animation is object specific, so if I move to another object, that keyframe will disappear, but that object, the keyframe will reappear once I select the object. So basically, we're going to do a translate, rotate, and scale animation here to get a brief overview of animation. So click the set key button, click the key button on the first frame you want to start your animation. The next step is move the frame to another frame, so I'm just going to move to the last frame, 24, and then change the attribute. So I just want to create a forward and maybe an up animation of this ball moving forward, and then I have to click on the set key button again to save that keyframe. If you don't click that key button again, it's not going to save the information. So once you do that, then you hit play, and there's your animation of the ball translating forward and up. So I can create an animation of translating all 3 axes, rotating all 3 axes, and scaling all 3 axes. So to be able to see scale or rotate a little bit easier and scale a little bit easier, I have a box over here. So for this idea, I want to create just a rotate animation. So same idea, make sure set key button is on, hit the key button, and maybe it's a forward movement as well. So we're going to go back to frame 0 and then move to frame 24 again. Move the box how we want to. Then I'm also going to get my rotate tool and rotate it around its axis. And at this point, the axis is actually at the bottom of the cube. So maybe rotate it around that and then hit the key button. So that way, it's actually rotating around. Then it goes to the ground here. So I might want to add another keyframe in between to be able to not make it go through another surface. So I can move to a middle frame, frame 12, get my move tool and move it up, and just hit the key button. So every time I want to set a key, I need to make sure the set key button is on and then hit the key button once I change the attribute. So then the object will rotate forward and also translate forward and up. So I could also do a scaling animation as well when I come over here to a new frame, and maybe I'm getting my scale tool and scaling it out a little bit. So I can do it in all 3 axes, but I'll show you just one axis to begin with. And if I hit my scale key button, or my key button, and then go back and play my animation, it will then animate between this frame on frame 12 and frame 24, scaling out. So at any point I can go hit the play button to review my animation at real time, or I can just scrub back and forth to see a little bit slower there. But hitting play will make sure you're watching your animation at 30 frames per second so you're getting the right speed. So I can also move to my 4-point view and select another view and hit play, and it'll animate it in that view. So it'll only animate in one view, but I can animate in multiple views, or rather it's already animated. I can just select a different view to animate it. So that's pretty much the basics of animation. The timeline down here, I can go change my preferences if I want to. Go to the start frame, set your first keyframe, move the frame, change the attribute, and then set the keyframe. So that's it for this tutorial on the animation basics.